Good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce the two following speakers, Helen Kohn and Francesca Croce. They are Raphael experts, of course, and I'll talk about this later, but what is so funny is that Larissa Moore, who was on the podium with me before and who is the co-curator of the show, Francesca, Helen and I, we are all connected to Vienna, Austria. So I'm Austrian, lived in Vienna, studied there. But Larissa studied in Vienna, and these two ladies as well. And I think it's a nice coincidence that we all gather in Columbus, Ohio right now. Francesca Croce is a Columbus native, and she studies in Vienna, does her PhD, and focuses on the reception of Raphael on Marathi in Bellori. So one a painter, the other an art writer, who called Marathi the new Raphael. And so it's a theoretical work on the reception of Raphael and his fame. And Helen Kohn has co-curated another Raphael exhibition together with me on Raphael as a painter of Madonnas, which we did at the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden. And right now she's working on her PhD on Correggio, on one of his famous altarpieces, also in the collection of the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden, the Madonna of Saint Sebastian. So welcome, and we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Yes. So thank you, Stefan. Yeah, so we are going to talk about Raphael, his life and legacy, and in the legacy part we are basically going to focus on the 16th and 17th century. And yeah, for Raphael's life a very important source was Giorgio Vasari, so we are going to quote him. And yeah, so maybe who was Giorgio Vasari and why is he so important?
So, Giorgio Vasari was an art historian, and he was a biographer who lived in the 16th century. And in 1550, he publishes a compendium of artists' lives. There's then a second edition about 20 years later. And this work is focused around artists from Tuscany. And he is very important to us because he's basically considered the father of modern art history. And many of the artists that we admire today, our admiration is based on how these artists' lives were transmitted to us through Vasari. Now, Vasari didn't know many of these artists personally, but in the case of Raphael, he did meet one of his students, Giulio Romano. So he was able to get first-hand anecdotes from his student, which he then transmitted in his Vitae. Now, we have to take Vasari with a grain of salt. Not everything he says is true, but this is not the focus of our presentation today, because also the way we understand Raphael, his work and his life and how he was then understood in the 17th century is based on what Vasari left us. So, Helen, what can you tell us about Raphael's early life?
Yes, and also like you can see here a portrait of Raphael. So this is the frontispiece of Raphael's life in Vasari's book. So yeah, but we know that Raphael was born in 1483, and you can see here an early Madonna and Child painting. And Raphael was born into a family of, his father was an artist himself. He had a successful workshop in Urbino, and he was most likely also the court painter of Federico da Montefeltro. So this was kind of this was Raphael's early influence. Urbino, his father, but unfortunately his father dies really early. So in 1494, his father dies, and Raphael inherited this large workshop from his father, and it's only a few years later that we already know that he was an independent artist. And so what you're seeing here is a painting by Pietro Perugino, also a Madonna and Child painting, and something that is really important why we think of Raphael is that he sees artists, he sees other artists, he kind of realizes what is important, what can I absorb, what can I use for my art, and the first like really important artist for him is Perugino. So Vasari tells us Perugino was Raphael's teacher, but as I said, Raphael was from really early on, he was an independent artist. So Perugino was most likely not his teacher, it was more like he was working together with Raphael was working together with Perugino, but he was already an independent artist. But what you can see if you are looking at those paintings is that, of course, Raphael was really looking at Perugino. You can see a similar kind of face of the Madonna. You can also see a similar handling of the Christ child. And another important influence is also Pinturicchio, who you can also see here. Painting is in the Cleveland Museum, so not so far away. And you can see the Christ child is holding a book, which is a symbol of revelation. And that was something that Pinturicchio was painting a lot at the end of the 15th century. So this is most likely why we can also see it in the painting of Raphael. So yeah, this is kind of the important sources that Raphael has at the beginning of his career. And
we selected a quote for you from Vasari where he talks about the way Raphael is looking at Perugino. So Vasari says, he imitated it so exactly and in all its details that his portraits could not be distinguished from his master's originals. Now this is something to keep in mind when we will then show you the evolution of Raphael's career, because his style does not stay like this. So Helen, you've told us that he is looking at all of the artists working around Urbino at the time. And then we know that he ends up in Rome. So what would you say is an early turning point in his career?
Yeah, so Florence at the time is the center of art. So it's a place where Leonardo works, it's a place where Michelangelo works. So in 1504, Raphael decides to go to Florence and to work there to see the most important artists at the time. And we are showing you here two paintings. One is a small Lamentation of the Dead Christ, which he did before he went to Florence, and one is a painting which he did in 1507, so before he goes to Rome. And it's really only a short time that he stays in Florence, but you can see how his style develops. For example, you have a clear narration in the painting, in the entombment. You can see kind of there's a beginning and an end to the story. So you can see there's this figure like holding the dead body of Christ, and then this whole scenery is evolving into the direction of the grave where they will bring the dead body of Christ. Then you have, for example, this kind of emotions that you can see in the faces of the figures. This is, I think, very visible, for example, in St. Peter. So St. Peter is in the Lamentation. It is the person on the right side who's like crossing his hand. He's looking at the dead body of Christ, but he's not really too much moved from the scenery. And then you have like St. Peter here in the entombment. He's so touched by what he's seeing that he's like turning away. And you can see, I mean, in the other faces, you can also see those kind of different emotions. So this is something that he really quickly observes and learns while he is in Florence. And something else that is very important is also the study of the nude body. So this is something that he learns in Florence, most likely from Leonardo, who was doing all his like anatomical studies. And you can see here where he really, like before he painted, he studied the nude figures. He studied how would it look like if a person would really hold such a dead body. And you can also see this, I mean, if we can go back one slide again, you can see that if we compare the arm of Christ. So in the earlier Lamentation, it's just like you can't really see, for example, muscles, which you can then really see. So you can see he studied anatomy. And yeah, but he stays in Florence only until 1508, and then he's deciding to go somewhere else. And that because Rome is the new center. So what is happening in Rome?
Indeed. So in 1503, Giuliano della Rovere is elected Pope Julius II. A few years before, someone we've heard about before, Michelangelo, has gone to from Florence to Rome, and he has just finished in 1499 one of his most famous sculptures, the Pietà, which is today in the Basilica of St. Peter's. He goes back to Florence, but is recalled in the early years of the 1500s by Pope Julius II to make his funerary monument, which is today in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli, which was the titular church of Julius II. Now, the Pope wants to leave a mark on the arts in Rome. So what is his plan? He wants to redecorate the Vatican Palace. So in 1508, Michelangelo starts decorating the Sistine Chapel with figures and scenes from the Old Testament. That same year, according to Vasari, a very famous architect of the time called Bramante, also from the city of Urbino, and who is said to be a family member of Raphael. Like I said, true or not, we don't know. But through Bramante, Raphael comes to Rome and begins to work at the Vatican in the service of Julius II. So Helen, can you tell us a little more about the works that he's executing in the Vatican Palace?
Yeah, as Francesca said, he's called to Rome. Raphael knows there's a job. He can decorate the papal apartment, but he arrives in Rome and he thought he could be the only artist kind of decorating the apartment. But then there are other artists who are also decorating and already like rooms that are finished. So he starts to paint one of his frescoes, and after Julius II sees Raphael's fresco, he's so pleased that he decides that only Raphael should paint them. And I also want to quote Vasari on this. So Raphael also adorned this painting with perspective and many figures completed with such a delicate and soft style that it caused Pope Julius to destroy all the scenes painted by other masters from the past and present, so that Raphael alone would be honored above all those who had labored on the painting which had been done up to that time. So, yeah, Raphael then could paint a papal apartment, which was really important also for his later commissions. He becomes a really famous artist at the time. And yeah, you can see here one of the most famous scenes from the Stanza della Segnatura, which is the school of Athens. And we're comparing it here to a painting by fresco by Perugino, because you already heard about Perugino. He was kind of his early influence, and we want to show how kind of Raphael is in Rome and what is kind of he learning there. So a really, really important influence there is like antique sculptures and architecture. So you can also see that in the School of Athens, where you can see the sculptures that he painted. And of course the architecture. And then also comparing it with Perugino, you can see Perugino, everything is kind of focused in the foreground. The groups are very kind of static. And then in the School of Athens, you can see the different people are in a conversation. There are like different sceneries where things like smaller, other sceneries kind of people are in conversation. So this is all something that happens when Raphael is in Rome. And he also paints a portrait of his of Pope Julius, which you can see here.
Which inspired us to use green as our background,
yes.
as you can imagine. So Pope Julius II commissions and donates this portrait to the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. And this portrait was displayed near the main altar for 8 days during a feast in the honor of the Virgin Mary. Now, something to have in mind in this church, Santa Maria del Popolo, is that on the high altar there was an icon of the Madonna and Child that was believed to have been painted by St. Luke. So here already you have a statement about who gets to be placed where. Reminder, St. Luke is the patron saint of artists. This is very important. Vasari tells us about this portrait, And since he had made an illustrious name for himself, this is Raphael, he painted a portrait in oil of Pope Julius during this time, which was so lifelike and real that it made the onlooker shrink from it in fear, as if the Pope were truly alive. Now, this was one of the few times in which a portrait by Raphael or a painting by Raphael could be seen by the general public. An interesting fact about the sitter, and you'll notice that he has a very melancholic look to himself, and he is wearing this very disheveled beard. He had been ill for a long time and was very depressed and had sworn to keep his beard until the French troops were kicked out of Italy. He had been defeated at Bologna, and so he said, I will keep this until the French are out. He was also cured of his illness, and so he donated his portrait in a way as a votive offering to the Virgin Mary to say thank you for what has happened. Another interesting fact about Santa Maria del Popolo is the story of its founding. So it is said to have been built atop the ashes of Nero, Emperor Nero. And the legend is that on the ashes of Nero, there was a tree that grew, and this tree was possessed by demons, and these demons would torment all of the travelers that would enter Rome through the Via Flaminia. Now, everyone was very distressed about these demons tormenting everyone, including Pope Pascal II. And the Pope has a vision in which the Virgin Mary appears to him and tells him what he needs to do in order to banish these demons. As you can imagine, this involves building a church in the honor of the Virgin Mary. So this he does. The Pope removes the tree himself, and on the ashes they build Santa Maria del Popolo. So this is layer upon layer upon layer in this church. And this portrait of Julius II was also displayed alongside another painting by Raphael. This is the Madonna di Loreto, which was for a long time the only autograph painting by Raphael visible in a Roman church. Now, Julius II and then Pope Leo X with the tapestries weren't the only people commissioning works by Raphael. Another very important painter was a rich banker from Siena, Agostino Chigi, who is lending money to the most influential people of the day, the Medici, the Borgia, the popes, etc. And in Rome, he buys a villa on the other side of the Tiber, now called Villa Farnesina because it was then acquired by the Farnese family, but it was owned by Chigi. And Chigi asks very important artists to come decorate his villa, and who does he ask among others? Raphael. And the resulting works are the Loggia of Cupid and Psyche, and also the Loggia of Galatea.
Yes.
How could one artist manage such a large amount of works? I mean, we have heard from Larissa and Stefan about the work involved in tapestry making and in designing these tapestries and these cartoons. So what else can you tell us about how Raphael is executing all these works? How does he have the time?
Yeah, I want to quote Vasari first. So Vasari says, and he, Raphael, always kept a great number of artisans at work, helping them and teaching them with the kind of love that is more appropriately given to one's own children than to other artisans. So very important, and something that was, besides that Raphael kind of, while he was looking at other artists, he kind of saw what is really what could help him for his artwork. Something else that was really important was he employed a really large workshop, and I mean, that was not something new, but was something that was really new was that he was not only kind of they were not only copying his style or copying his drawings, but he was really good at kind of finding out what was also the skill an artisan had, an artist, so he used them. For example, we earlier also heard about Giovanni da Udine, and in the Loggia, something that he realized, Giovanni da Udine was really good at studying animals, and for example, Giovanni da Udine then could just like use his skill in the workshop. So he was decorating, for example, the birds in the decoration of the Loggia. So this was something that where he also used his workshop for, and this is in general, the workshop was the reason why he could take on so many commissions. And it was also, he's supposedly among one of the first managers. And also if you're thinking of contemporary artists, this is something that is still, there are still artists who have like large workshops, for example, also like Damien Hirst, or there's a German sculptor, Alicia Quades, so she has the designs, but then kind of she has this workshop who's helping her to take on all the commissions, and this is something that Raphael was really good at, and this is something that, but it's also like, it's not that we think of those works not as works by Raphael. It is a work by Raphael. It's just he was really good at managing.
Vasari tells us also that Raphael he couldn't be seen leaving his house without around 50 young men following him. So he really lived in close quarters and was always working and interacting with his studio. Like we've talked about his works in Rome and in the Vatican Palace, many of Raphael's works weren't publicly visible. So how did Raphael manage to reach such a large and varied group of artists and patrons?
Yeah, so from early on, he also worked together with an engraver, Marcantonio Raimondi. And so Raimondi came most likely at the same time to Rome as Raphael. He was an independent artist, and I also want to quote Vasari on, but it's apart from Raimondi's life, how supposedly Raphael and Raimondi met. So, but to return to Marcantonio, on his arrival in Rome, he engraved in copper a most beautiful sheet by Raphael of Urbino, in which was represented a Roman Lucretia killing herself, done with such diligence and beautiful manner that on its being immediately brought to Raphael by some of his friends, he was inclined to have some drawings of his things produced in print. So the drawing that you can see here on the slide is most likely not the drawing that Raimondi used for his engraving, but you can see it must have been a very similar drawing that was then engraved by Raimondi. And there we can also see a skill of Raphael, because he saw that kind of this would be really help him to be a successful artist, because most of the artworks he had done, especially also the frescoes, they were not visible to like other artists, and so he realized that this would be a really important medium to disseminate his ideas, and this was also what was happening. So Raimondi engraved many of his drawings, many of his designs, and they were then not only visible in Rome, but in Florence, in Venice, but also in, for example, like northern cities. And and what you can also see here is a portrait that Raphael did of himself. So you can see like here in the Stanza di Eliodoro, you can see the Pope is pointing on someone. This is a portrait of Raphael, but you can see also the other person that is looking at us. And this is most likely a portrait of Raimondi. So you can see how important he was, that he was really like not only portraying himself, but also Raimondi. And supposedly, Vasari also writes that they were friends. So what do we know about his personal life?
Well, one of the very entertaining things that we know about Raphael's personal life is that he was a big ladies' man. And Vasari tells us that Raphael secretly attended to his love affairs and pursued amorous pleasures beyond all moderation. And on one occasion, he happened to be even more immoderate than usual, having returned home for that reason with a very high fever. It is rumored that Raphael died of venereal disease. Whether this is true or not, we don't know, but it was a well-known fact that Raphael enjoyed the company of young women. And this went as far as interfering with his work. Agostino Chigi, who we mentioned when we talked about Villa Farnesina, had to bring in Raphael's mistress to the villa in order for the artist to keep working. And Vasari believed that this woman was Raphael's lover, the baker's daughter, La Fornarina. But it is more likely that this is not La Fornarina, but an aristocratic Roman woman who was married. She's wearing a veil. And you can also see that she's not a simple, humble woman by the jewelry that she's wearing. But what is so fascinating about this portrait is the garment itself. I mean, the sleeve is really a work of art. Raphael was engaged to a woman called Maria Bibbiena. She was the niece of a cardinal. Now, Raphael was not too keen to marry her, and luckily for him, she passed away in 1520. But then, unluckily for him, he died a couple of months later while he was executing his last work. Now, Helen will tell us a little bit more about this last work.
Yeah, so this is the Transfiguration. It's Raphael's last work, and it was done for Giulio de' Medici, and it should have been sent to France, but Raphael dies, so it stays in Rome. It's still in Rome. And it shows a scene, or it shows two scenes that Raphael for the first time connected. So it's in the upper part, you can see the transfiguration of Christ, and in the lower part you can see Christ healing the possessed boy. And this is a scene that is not connected, but it normally or often follows each other during the service. And it was also a very influential work. For example, Titian was influenced when he paints his Assunta, but also Correggio when he paints his dome frescoes. And something else that is interesting about this painting is that it was shown above Raphael's casket.
Yes, I would like to read you a passage from Vasari's description of Raphael's death. He says, Raphael came to the end of his life's journey on the same day that he was born, which was Good Friday. When this noble artisan died, painting too might as well have died, for when he closed his eyes, painting was left almost blind. Now, it's important here to note the emphasis on the birth date and death date of Raphael, this Good Friday, 37 years. There are parallels here that are being made between Raphael and Christ. It is said that everyone attending his funeral died, even Pope Leo. There is a legend even that says that parts of the Vatican cracked when the news was spread. No artist garnered such attention and such pomp as Raphael did since antiquity. And when he was on his deathbed, Raphael made plans for what was going to happen. So he wrote his will, and he left his possessions to his favorite pupils, Giulio Romano, Penni, and he made plans on his burial spot. And he chose to be buried at the Pantheon. For this, he commissioned Lorenzetto to sculpt a Madonna and Child to put above his tomb. Now, to be buried at the Pantheon and to choose to be buried at the Pantheon was to make a statement, an important statement. The Pantheon was a church and is today still a church, Santa Maria della Rotonda, but was first an ancient temple. So here you have, once again, the different layers of history that constitute Rome, and how Raphael really wanted to be inscribed within this history of ancient works and ancient culture, but also of Christianity, which is, he was serving the Pope, so obviously he had to make a statement on this. He was not the only artist buried at the Pantheon. One of the artists we are going to focus on later in this presentation was also buried at the Pantheon. It's Annibale Carracci.
Yeah, and we would like to focus on Raphael's legacy, and we will mention Annibale Carracci, Guido Reni, and Carlo Maratti, who were really important for his legacy in the 16th and 17th century. Yeah, and we will start with Annibale, who, as Francesca said, was also buried at the Pantheon and even in the same chapel as Raphael. And he was really heavily influenced by him. He was a Bolognese artist, and he came to Rome at the end of the 16th century. And he was called there to paint the frescoes in the Palazzo Farnese, who are now among the most famous frescoes after the frescoes in the Vatican in Rome.
So in 1595, Annibale, his brother, and their school are called to Rome to decorate, like you said, the Palazzo Farnese. And at the Palazzo Farnese, he executes frescoes as well as canvases on mythological episodes. And the Farnese wanted to honor their family by also depicting episodes from the life of Hercules. They claim they descended from Hercules. Every great family claimed they descended from a great mythological figure. And so this painting over here, which is an oil on canvas, you'll see that it's in Naples, but it was initially in the Roman palace, hung on the ceiling. And it is representing Hercules at the crossroads. He has to choose between two paths, the right path of virtue and then the wrong path, which would be that of vice. So virtue is on Hercules' right, and vice is on Hercules' left. And here you can see Carracci is clearly referencing one of the figures on the lower part of Raphael's Transfiguration. Now, Annibale is looking at Raphael and incorporating him into his art, but it is not his objective to be considered the new Raphael. This is a later project that we will present you shortly.
Yeah, so we're seeing here that Annibale is really referencing Raphael, but in addition to this kind of artistic influence that Raphael had, it was also his life, and we heard about his life, which was written by Vasari, that was then used by another important writer, and that was Giovan Pietro Bellori, who used this to represent Annibale as the new Raphael.
Yes, so Bellori should be considered, or is considered, as the 17th century equivalent of Giorgio Vasari. Now, some differences here. We are no longer focusing on Tuscany, we are focusing on Rome, although the artists are not necessarily Roman. In the case of Annibale, we're talking about an artist from Bologna. And it is Bellori, along with his friend Maratti, who we see later, who really try to push this idea of who is the new Raphael. And Bellori starts by saying, okay, this is Annibale. For many years after Raphael's death, he becomes kind of unfashionable. So there is this desire to bring back the style of Raphael and present the new heir to this classical tradition. So Annibale Carracci's body was shown at the Pantheon, and Bellori describes this. Now, something to bear in mind is that Raphael's body was shown at his studio, and Annibale Carracci's body was shown at the Pantheon. But Bellori wants you to think that they were both shown in the same place. Bellori says, Where the people came to see the dismal obsequies and the dead body of Annibale, almost in the same place one was seeing Raphael again laid in state. Each person was visibly moved. His pupils accompanied him and cried for their master and father. The others lamented the damage inflicted to painting, seeing in his darkened eyes the extinction of the light of color and kissing his dead hand, which had given spirit and life to the shadows. A few other parallels here that they were trying to make with Christ. Remember Vasari telling us he was born and died on Good Friday at the age of 37. Here, Annibale's last work, Christ wearing the crown of thorns, was displayed at the top of his casket. Here you can see parallel is trying to be made between Annibale and Christ, who they wanted to show as having sacrificed themselves in the name of art. Now, the original of Annibale's painting is now lost, but luckily there is another version in the Museum of Dresden that you are seeing here today. Another parallel with this divine presence between Annibale and Christ is this idea that Bellori says about this hand giving life and breath, and who is giving life to everything. So this idea as a painter, as a creator figure is very important and will be used over and over again. Annibale led a great school in Rome. He was bringing with him many painters from Bologna. And these painters would dominate the artistic scene in the early half of the 17th century. Now, what else can we talk about? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so important was at the time Guido Reni. He was trained in Bologna, and a painting that was visible in Bologna was the Santa Cecilia by Raphael, and you can see here a copy made by Guido Reni. And before we talk about the copy, I want to quote Vasari again on the Santa Cecilia, so what he says about this painting. And in truth, although other paintings may be called paintings, those of Raphael are living things, for the flesh in his figures seem palpable, they breathe, their pulses beat, and their lifelike animation is conspicuous, and besides the praise they had already received, they earned for Raphael even greater renown.
So, you're probably asking yourself why an artist as well respected as Guido Reni would execute a copy by Raphael. A copy of Raphael. And this is because Raphael was incredibly popular, and everyone wanted to get their hands on a Raphael, but it was very difficult to do so. This painting of Santa Cecilia became one of probably the most famous representations of the saint. And it was in a church in Bologna. Now, like we said, Guido Reni is a Bolognese artist who then goes to Rome. So he's able to see this in Bologna. And he is commissioned in the last years of the 1500s a version to be sent to Rome. Why is this? Because they had just found the supposed body of Santa Cecilia, and they wanted to decorate the church of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere with episodes from the life of the saint. So Guido Reni is commissioned this painting. It probably made its way to Rome in before 1600. And as you can see, the Reni version is in San Luigi dei Francesi, not in Santa Cecilia in Trastevere. And this is probably because the commissioner donated the painting to San Luigi dei Francesi in 1612 when this chapel was finished. And Bellori talks about the importance of this painting in his life of Guido Reni. He says that Reni turned towards Raphael's Saint Cecilia that served him as a school, not only to obtain piece by piece those beautiful appearances, but also to copy them all with his own hand. And this, his own hand, is very important to note here, and how important it was for Reni to be the one copying the master and to have his name associated with that of Raphael.
Yeah. So we talked about Annibale Carracci, we talked about Guido Reni, but there was one more artist who was important for his legacy in the 16th and 17th century in Rome, and that was Carlo Maratti. And how did he use Raphael's life and his works to become the new Raphael?
So Raphael was certainly influential for a generation of artists, notably those that we talked about, the Bolognese artists coming to Rome in the early years of the 1600s and really dominating the artistic scene. But it isn't until the second half of the 17th century that there really is this creation of a myth around Raphael, of this divine figure that's being created, and this desire to find not replacements but heirs to this tradition. So who is the new Raphael? Annibale. And who is creating this? Bellori. Bellori is borrowing from Vasari, who we've been reading throughout, and re-elaborating what Vasari is giving to us with the lives of the painters that he's focusing on. Now, Maratti is training in the classical tradition. He moves to Rome at the age of 12. He starts working for painter Andrea Sacchi. Maratti might not be familiar to you, but at the time was the most influential painter in Rome. He painted for 7 popes, was also the court painter to Louis XIV of France. He lived for 88 years, so he had an incredibly long career and a very successful workshop, probably the largest workshop in Rome at the time. So like I said, he goes to Rome at the age of 11. He starts working for Sacchi, and one of the first things that Sacchi notices, according to Bellori, again, see how what biographers choose to stress. His master notices how much attention Maratti is paying to Raphael and how much time he's spending studying and copying his work. Maratti is also one of the greatest draftsmen of the 17th century, and this is a quality that he shares with Raphael, and that would be an important crutch for Bellori to strengthen the parallels between the two masters. And on the left, I have selected a painting to show you. This is the Immaculate Conception by Maratti in Santa Maria del Popolo, a church that should ring a bell. And this painting was executed in 1686 for the chapel of Cardinal Cibo. As you can see here, Maratti is quoting 2 different works by Raphael. The first is the Disputa that we saw at the Vatican Palace, and the other is the Madonna di Foligno. As you can see, the Madonna di Foligno is quoted in the upper half of the painting, while the floor of the Disputa is cited in the lower half of the Immaculate Conception. Why am I choosing to show you this painting? Well, we're coming full circle. This painting was placed directly opposite the Chigi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo, and the Chigi Chapel had been designed by Raphael. And so there's definitely an interplay between these 2 works. And another artist that had works in Santa Maria del Popolo was Annibale Carracci. So in this church, you no longer have, but the 2 paintings by Raphael were displayed, Julius II and the Madonna di Loreto. You had a work by Annibale, and then you had this work by Carlo Maratti. Here we end the supposed great legacy of artists, the heirs to Raphael.
Yeah, so Vasari tells us that Raphael was a mortal god, but it was really Annibale, Carlo Maratta, and Guido Reni who made him an immortal artist. Thank you.
Thank you.